Picture an empire so vast that the sun never set on its lands, a power that ruled the seas, shaped nations, and altered the course of history forever. This is the British Empire, the greatest machine of dominance the world has ever known. But how did a small island on the edge of Europe come to command a quarter of the globe? And why, after centuries of glory, did it fall? Welcome to Empire of History. In this first chapter, we dive into the rise and fall of the mightiest empire in history. Hit subscribe and ring the bell. This journey is just beginning. It all began on a cold, misty island where the people of England fought to survive in a brutal world. In the Middle Ages, this kingdom didn't seem destined for greatness, but something shifted. While kings waged wars and the church shaped minds, the English began to look beyond their shores. The sea, vast, treacherous, and brimming with promise, would become their secret weapon. The Royal Navy was born, and with it, ambition. In 1588, England faced its first great test, the mighty Spanish Armada, sent by King Philip II to crush them. Against all odds, with nimble ships and a stroke of luck, or perhaps a divine wind, England triumphed. That moment marked the dawn of their naval supremacy. The world began to tremble before a new power. With the seas under their command, the English set out to conquer land. In the early 17th century, they planted their flags in North America and the Caribbean. Places like Jamestown and Barbados weren't just colonies, they were gold mines in disguise. Sugar, tobacco, and rum filled the crown's coffers. But the real masterstroke came with the East India Company, a corporation so powerful it had its own armies and ruled entire territories. There was a dark side too. The slave trade fueled this wealth machine, linking Africa, America, and Europe in a triangle of profit and suffering. England wasn't just claiming land, it was building a global system. The sun was rising over the British Empire, and it had no intention of setting anytime soon. By the 18th century, the empire exploded. From the mysterious lands of India to the wild frontiers of Australia, the British seemed unstoppable. But not everything was perfect. In 1776, the 13 American colonies rebelled and won. It was a bitter blow, but the empire pressed on. The Industrial Revolution brought machines, steam, and an economic might no one could match. While other nations scrambled to keep up, England reshaped the world with steel, trade, and ambition. This was the Golden Century, a time of triumph, but also a hint of greater challenges to come. With the seas tamed and the Armada vanquished, Britain's gaze turned outward, beyond its misty shores, to lands ripe with promise. The naval might forged in the 16th century now carried a nation into a new age, the age of colonies. Welcome to the 17th century, where the sun began to rise over an empire in the making. From the wild shores of America to the exotic East, Britain planted its roots and its ambitions. The journey began across the Atlantic. In 1607, a band of English settlers, weary but determined, stepped onto the shores of Virginia, founding Jamestown. It was a foothold in a vast, untamed land, the first whisper of a British America. Tobacco soon became king, its leaves turning swamps into profit as plantations sprawled across the Chesapeake. Further south, the Caribbean beckoned with sweeter spoils. By the 1620s, islands like Barbados and Jamaica fell under British sway, their fertile soils yielding sugar, a white gold that sweetened tea and fattened purses back home. Rum flowed from the cane, and the colonies thrived, their harbors bustling with ships. These were no mere outposts. They were the seeds of an empire, sown in soil and sweat, promising riches that would fuel Britain's rise. But the empire's eyes weren't fixed westward alone. In the east, a titan was rising, the East India Company. Chartered in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I, it began as a modest venture, a handful of traders seeking silk, spices, and tea. Yet by the 17th century, it was no longer just bartering. It was building an empire of its own. From its base in Surat to the ports of Madras and Bombay, the company wove a web of commerce across India. Pepper, cloves, and tea poured into Britain, delighting palates and swelling coffers. But trade soon turned to power. Armed with private armies and royal backing, the company clashed with local rulers and rival Europeans, French and Dutch alike, carving out territories with muskets and cunning. By century's end, it was a force to be reckoned with, a merchant empire within an empire, laying the groundwork for Britain's eastern dominion. Yet, beneath the sunlit rise of colonies lay a shadow, a trade as cruel as it was profitable. The slave trade, born in the 16th century, exploded in the 17th as Britain's colonial ambitions grew. Ships sailed from West Africa, their holds packed with men, women, and children torn from their homes, a human cargo bound for the Americas and Caribbean. In places like Barbados and Virginia, these enslaved souls toiled under the lash, harvesting sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the lifeblood of Britain's wealth. The triangular trade linked three continents, immigrants, African slaves to the New World, plantation goods to Britain, and British wares back to Africa. By the late 17th century, Britain was a titan in this grim commerce, its ports like Bristol and Liverpool thriving on the profits of suffering. It was a dark engine driving the empire forward, a price paid in blood for the sun to rise higher. The age of colonies marked the dawn of Britain's empire, a time when the New World and the East bent to its will, and a dark trade fueled its ascent. The sun was rising, casting its light across oceans, but brighter days and greater trials lay ahead. What would this growing power become in the Golden Century? With the sun climbing higher over its colonies, the British Empire set its sights beyond the Americas and the Caribbean. The foundations laid by explorers and traders in the 17th century now bore fruit. A golden age was dawning. Welcome to the 18th century, the Golden Century, where Britain's reach stretched to new horizons, its wealth soared, and its power seemed boundless. But with every triumph came trials, revolutions that would test its might. Let's dive into this era of dominion and defiance. The 18th century ignited Britain's imperial ambition like never before. In India, the East India Company, once a mere trading outfit, morphed into a juggernaut of power. By mid-century, it wasn't just bartering spices and silk, it was conquering kingdoms. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 handed Bengal to the company, its redcoats and cannons toppling local rulers with ruthless precision. India's riches, cotton, tea, and opium, flooded British markets, turning the subcontinent into the empire's pulsing vein. Meanwhile, Africa's shores beckoned. Britain tightened its grip on the West African coast, building forts like Cape Coast Castle to guard the slave trade, a grim but lucrative pillar of its growing wealth. Gold, ivory, and human lives flowed across the Atlantic, linking Africa to the empire's global web. It was a foothold, not yet the full conquest of later years, but a sign of things to come. And then there was Australia, a wild, uncharted frontier. In 1788, the first fleet dropped anchor at Botany Bay, carrying convicts, soldiers, and dreams of a new colony. What began as a penal outpost grew into a foothold on a continent ripe for expansion. From India's palaces to Africa's forts to Australia's shores, Britain's flag flew higher, a dominion stretching across oceans and cultures, fueled by ambition and audacity. But not every corner of the empire bowed willingly. Across the Atlantic, the 13 colonies, once loyal outposts, simmered with discontent. Taxes like the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Tea Act of 1773 lit the fuse, stoking cries of no taxation without representation. In 1773, the Boston Tea Party saw colonists dump tea into the harbor, a defiant spark that Britain couldn't ignore. War broke out in 1775, a brutal clash between redcoats and ragtag militias. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 made it official. Britain poured troops and treasure into the fight, but the colonists, aided by France's navy and a fierce will, proved relentless. In 1781 at Yorktown, General Cornwallis surrendered, and with him fell Britain's hold on America. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 sealed the loss. The 13 colonies were gone, a wound to Britain's pride and a warning of its limits. Yet even as one dominion slipped away, the empire turned its gaze elsewhere, its golden century far from over. From the ashes of rebellion rose a new kind of power. The Industrial Revolution, brewing since the late 17th century, erupted in the 18th, and Britain led the charge. Machines like the spinning jenny and the water frame turned cotton into gold, flooding markets with textiles cheaper than ever. Then came James Watt's steam engine in the 1770s, a beast of iron and fire that powered factories, mines, and ships. By the 1780s, railways began to spider across Britain, linking coal mines to ports, villages to cities. Coal blackened the skies, but it fueled an economy that outpaced the world. London's docks brimmed with goods, Indian tea, African gold, Caribbean sugar, all processed by an industrial machine that never slept. Britain wasn't just an empire of land anymore, it was an empire of wealth, its coffers swelling as its rivals scrambled to catch up. This economic might cemented the Golden Century. The loss of America stung, but it barely slowed the juggernaut. Britain's factories and fleets turned it into the world's banker and workshop, a power not just of conquest, but of creation. The Golden Century crowned Britain with dominion and defiance, a time when its reach touched 3 continents, its pride weathered rebellion, and its machines reshaped the world. But this was only the beginning of its peak. And so, as the Golden Century forged a world of steel and ambition, the British Empire stepped into its most radiant era. The machines that roared in the 18th century had laid the foundation, but what followed was a reign of unparalleled splendor and power. This is the Victorian era, where Britain didn't just rule the globe, it redefined it. Yet, even in its shining moment, the winds of change were stirring. Let's unravel this chapter of glory and the shadows that crept beneath it. In 1837, a 19-year-old princess named Victoria was crowned queen, a figurehead who would become the symbol of an empire at its peak. Under her 63-year reign, Britain's dominions swelled to cover over 14 million square miles and 400 million people, a quarter of the planet's land and population. They called it the Pax Britannica, a golden age of peace, but it was a peace enforced by the mightiest navy the world had ever seen and an economy that churned relentlessly. The Industrial Revolution had reached its zenith. Britain's factories produced everything from textiles to cannons, feeding a global appetite for goods. Railways snaked across continents, from the plains of Canada to the jungles of India, binding the empire together with iron veins. London, now a sprawling metropolis of gas lamps and grand architecture, stood as the nerve center of this colossal machine. But this wasn't just about power, it was about presence. English became the language of law and commerce worldwide. From Bombay to Sydney, British culture, its literature, its manners, its very way of life, seeped into every corner of the empire. At Victoria's height, Britain wasn't merely a nation, it was a vision of civilization itself, casting a shadow so vast that the sun, quite literally, never set upon it. Yet, even with the world at its feet, Britain's appetite grew sharper. By the 1880s, a new frontier beckoned, Africa, a continent bursting with promise and peril. In what history calls the scramble for Africa, the British plunged in, claiming lands from the Nile's banks in Egypt to the rugged Cape of South Africa. Explorers like David Livingstone charted the unknown, while soldiers and administrators followed, planting the Union Jack in soil rich with gold, diamonds, and ivory. The rewards were immense. The diamond mines of Kimberley and the gold fields of the Transvaal turned Britain's coffers into a bottomless well. Places like Nigeria and Kenya became cogs in the imperial machine, supplying raw materials to feed the factories back home. But this wasn't a quiet conquest. It was a race. France, Germany, and Belgium joined the fray, each carving their own slices of Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 tried to impose order, drawing borders with the precision of a surgeon, but it only masked the growing rivalry. Britain's grip on the continent was ironclad, from the Suez Canal to the southern tip, yet every victory came with a cost. Local resistance flared, the Zulu warriors in 1879, the Mahdi's revolt in Sudan, and Europe's jealous eyes watched closely. The empire stood taller than ever, but the ground beneath it was beginning to tremble. Then, as the 20th century dawned, the empire faced trials it could never have imagined in Victoria's gilded halls. In 1914, the First World War erupted, a clash of empires that pulled Britain into its vortex. The call went out, and the colonies answered. Indian sepoys, Canadian infantrymen, African porters, millions marched under the Union Jack to fight in Europe's blood-soaked fields. The war ended in 1918 with victory, but the scars ran deep. Over 1 million from the empire lay dead, and Britain's wealth was bled dry, rebuilding a shattered world. The peace was fleeting. In 1939, the Second World War ignited, and Britain once again stood as a bulwark, this time against the Axis tide. Cities like London endured the Blitz, their skies lit by fire and defiance. Colonial troops fought from Burma to North Africa, and the empire's resources fueled the war machine. Victory came in 1945, but at what cost? Billions in debt, industries gutted, and a population exhausted. The wars proved Britain's resilience, but they also laid bare its fragility. The empire that once seemed invincible now staggered, its strength sapped by battles it couldn't afford to lose or win. The sun still shone, but its light was dimming, and the world it had ruled was stirring with new voices. From the zenith of Victoria's reign to the crucible of war, the British Empire touched the heavens and felt the weight of its own mortality. What happens when a colossus built on conquest faces a world ready to reclaim its freedom? The Golden Century had forged an empire of steel and ambition, its machines and wealth reshaping the globe. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the sun that shone so brightly over Britain's dominion faced its sternest test. Welcome to the era of the World Wars, a crucible of fire and blood that would mark the beginning of the end for the British Empire. From the trenches of Europe to the colonies that fueled its fight, this was a time of sacrifice, ruin, and awakening. Let's step into the storm that shook an empire to its core. The first blow came in 1914. 1914, when the First World War erupted, a cataclysm born of European rivalries and tangled alliances. Britain, at the helm of its vast empire, leapt into the fray against Germany and the Central Powers. The Royal Navy, still the world's mightiest, blockaded enemy ports, while the British Expeditionary Force, a small but elite army, landed in France to hold the line. But this was no war for Britain alone. The empire rallied its colonies. Over 1 million Indian soldiers marched to the Western Front and Mesopotamia, their turbans a stark contrast to the mud-soaked trenches. Canadians stormed Vimy Ridge in 1917. Australians and New Zealanders, the Anzacs, bled at Gallipoli in 1915. African porters hauled supplies across deserts, their labor unseen but vital. By 1918, nearly 3 million colonial troops had fought under the Union Jack, a testament to the empire's reach and a burden it could scarcely bear. Victory came on November 11, 1918, after 4 years of slaughter. The Treaty of Versailles redrew maps, granting Britain new territories like Iraq and Palestine from the fallen Ottoman Empire. But the cost was staggering. Over 900,000 British and colonial lives lost, billions in debt, and an economy reeling from war's insatiable hunger. The Great War proved the empire's strength, but it also cracked its foundations. Peace was a fleeting illusion. In 1939, the Second World War ignited, pitting Britain against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. This time, the stakes were existential. After France fell in 1940, Britain stood alone, its cities hammered by the Blitz, a relentless German bombing campaign that turned London into a sea of fire and rubble. Winston Churchill's voice rallied the nation. "We shall never surrender," the empire answered again. The Battle of Britain saw the Royal Air Force, bolstered by pilots from Canada, Australia, and beyond, repel the Luftwaffe in 1940. In North Africa, British and Indian divisions clashed with Rommel's Afrika Korps, securing Egypt and the Suez Canal. In Asia, Burmese and African troops fought Japan's advance, while Australia faced bombings on its own soil. The empire's resources, oil from the Middle East, rubber from Malaya, fueled the war machine, even as its colonies bore the brunt. Victory arrived in 1945, with Germany crushed and Japan capitulating after atomic devastation. But the toll was apocalyptic. Another 1 million dead across the empire, cities in ruins, and a debt of 21 billion, much of it owed to the United States. Britain had survived, but its imperial might was shattered, its grip on the world slipping as new powers rose from the ashes. The wars didn't just weaken Britain, they awakened its colonies. In India, the jewel of the empire, the fight for freedom gained unstoppable momentum. The Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi and Nehru, had long demanded self-rule, but the wars turned promises into action. Indian troops had died for Britain. Now they wanted their reward. By 1942, the Quit India movement saw millions defy British rule, their peaceful resistance met with arrests and violence. The ripples spread. In Africa, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya saw Britain's exhaustion as their chance. The 1941 Atlantic Charter, signed by Churchill and Roosevelt, promised self-determination, words Britain meant for Europe, but colonies seized for themselves. In the Caribbean, unrest brewed in Jamaica and Trinidad, workers striking against a weakened overlord. The empire's machinery faltered, military bases closed, budgets shrank, and Britain's will to govern eroded. The wars had drained its coffers and exposed its vulnerabilities, a titan too tired to hold its dominions. By the late 1940s, the sun that never set was setting fast, as voices once silenced now roared for freedom. The world wars marked the twilight of the British Empire, a time when its courage shone, its strength crumbled, and its colonies rose. The sun that once blazed across the globe now flickered, setting the stage for a final fall. What happens when an empire can no longer rule? The world wars had left the British Empire staggering, its strength drained, its colonies restless. The sun that once refused to set now teetered on the horizon, casting long shadows over a dominion unraveling. The end began with a seismic break. India, the crown jewel, slipped from Britain's grasp. After decades of struggle, fueled by the war's promises and sacrifices, independence arrived on August 15, 1947. The British Raj dissolved, giving birth to India and Pakistan amid celebration and the chaos of partition, where millions migrated and violence claimed countless lives. Viceroy Lord Mountbatten oversaw the handover, a bittersweet farewell to a land that had defined Britain's imperial glory. The dominoes fell fast. West. In Africa, the Gold Coast became Ghana in 1957, the first sub-Saharan colony to break free, led by Kwame Nkrumah's vision of a new Africa. Nigeria followed in 1960, its oil-rich lands slipping from British control. Kenya's path was bloodier. The Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s forced Britain's hand, granting independence in 1963 after a brutal struggle. In the Caribbean, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago claimed freedom in 1962 and 1963, their vibrant cultures stepping out from colonial rule. By the 1960s, over 50 territories had shed British rule, a cascade of independence that shrank the empire to a fraction of its former self. Britain, exhausted by war and unable to resist, lowered its flags, not in defeat, but in retreat from a world it could no longer hold. The fall of the empire sent shockwaves across the globe. Between 1945 and 1970, dozens of new nations emerged, their borders redrawn, their voices unleashed. At the United Nations, former colonies like India and Ghana took their seats, shifting power from imperial capitals to a multipolar world. Trade routes once dominated by Britain fragmented as nations forged their own paths, some thriving, others stumbling in the chaos of newfound freedom. For Britain, the loss was profound. The empire had been its economic backbone, raw materials from Africa, tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean. Now, those arteries were cut. Post-war austerity lingered, industries withered, and Britain's global influence waned. The United States and Soviet Union, bolstered by the wars, stepped into the vacuum, their Cold War rivalry eclipsing the old imperial order. Britain, once the world's arbiter, became a partner in a new game, its empire a memory, its power a shadow. Yet the world didn't just lose an empire, it gained a mosaic of nations, each carrying scars and dreams from Britain's reign. The fall marked the end of an era, but the birth of a modern age. Even as the empire crumbled, its spirit endured. In 1949, the Commonwealth of Nations rose from the ashes, a voluntary union of 56 countries, from Canada to Kenya, bound not by chains, but by history. It's a living echo of empire, a forum where former colonies stand as equals, their leaders meeting under a shared past. The English language, once a tool of conquest, became a global bridge, spoken by over 2 billion people today, from Mumbai to Miami. British law shaped courts in India and Australia. Parliamentary democracy took root in Canada and South Africa, and tea remains a ritual from London to Lahore. These threads, subtle yet strong, weave Britain's legacy into the modern world. At home, the empire returned. Immigrants from India, Africa, and the Caribbean, once subjects, became citizens, their cultures enriching a Britain reborn. The empire that spanned continents now lives in its diversity, its story a complex tapestry of triumph, loss, and transformation. From a kingdom on a misty island to a dominion that spanned the earth, the British Empire rose, ruled, and fell, a saga of ambition, war, and change. The sun has set, but its light lingers in the nations it birthed and the world it shaped. This is the end of our journey, but history's lessons never fade.